All right. As always, we have very little to discuss. I know. But we're going to just jump right in tonight. Tonight we're going to start looking at modern Christianity. We're going to do it in two parts. Sorry for those of you who are looking to do something a little bit off the wall next week, but we're going to break it down into two parts. We're going to basically get to 1970 today, and then it will take off from thereafter. As always, rule one is we aren't covering everything. Even in that tiny little time span, there's no possible way to cover everything. There are a whole bunch of German philosophers and theologians I would love to tell you about, and we're not going to talk about any of them, except for one, and it's not Bonhoeffer. Rule two is that history is contested and not settled. That is especially true for the next two classes, because in many cases, we are still living out the effects of these of this class, and the next will be really right up into the very present. Rule three, we have a new rule this week. So this is your original research alert. We're going to talk about Nazi Germany today, and as soon as we leave Nazi Germany, there are no historians who have really written books about what we're going to be talking about. So most of what I have put forward to you this point, there are historians who may disagree with it, but it matches a certain set of academic standards to be what is called peer-reviewed. So what is peer review? It is a process in which research is anonymously read and verified by leaders in the field. So like I would send in a research paper, a group of experts reads the paper, checks the data, provides comments, and chooses to publish or not. So everything I've told you so far has been peer-reviewed. That doesn't mean that there's not disagreement, but it has gone through academic rigor. So, for example, one business professor I follow named Adam Grant sent in a paper, I think this was probably 3 years ago, and they decided not to publish, and they gave him comments on how to improve the paper. They said to Adam Grant that he should read Adam Grant's work and do work more like Adam Grant. So that's what I mean when I say it's anonymous. They don't know who it is. So there's no bias. So if Albert Einstein submitted a paper, it would be anonymous, and they would read it with that kind of academic rigor and testing, not assuming that he's right just because he's the smartest person. And so in this week, this is not peer reviewed. So this is more than any other class opinion. So that means it is very subject to interpretation. So I would not take this story to the bank in the same way that I have kind of tried to give you a story up until this point. It's just not possible for me to give it to you because I am not a PhD historian, nor have PhD historians written about this time period yet. Typically, they wait at least 100 years before writing about something. That's kind of a general rule of thumb. Sometimes you'll see it come out a little bit faster, but by and large, once we leave Nazi Germany, we are not 100 years less in time. And so there's just not the academic rigor that will exist for this period. So this is take this with a grain of salt, be very cautioned and so I cannot give that to you in stronger terms, I guess, than I normally do. So let's go to Germany in 1930. As of 1930 Germany, it was the philosophical and theological center of the world. The greatest theologians, the greatest thinkers, the greatest philosophers were German. All of that intellect existed inside Germany, and due to World War I and World War II, it will leave Germany and shift out of there, mostly to the United States. So to give you an idea of what 1930 Germany looks like, this is a coffee house. If you'll notice, those tables are squinched in the back. There's a reason for that. Inflation was so high that you could sit down at, let's say, 9 a.m. for your morning coffee, and by 10 a.m., your coffee would cost more. In fact, there were some days where while you were walking, the cost was going up. So they pushed your tables all the way to the back so that they could get the money, the coffee house could get the money they needed to charge you. So when we talk about hyperinflation, we're talking about people bringing a wheelbarrow full of German marks, paper money, and buying one loaf of bread. That's really bad. The time between World War I and the rise of Nazi Germany was not a great time to be a German. Unless you were a philosopher or a theologian, and even then, it wasn't great. And so, because of these harsh conditions, in many ways that were economical, we saw the rise of the Nazi Party come about. And it came under the idea of make Germany great. This is your Roman eagle seal that you can find in the Pantheon. This is the seal of the Holy Roman Empire. And there is your Nazi eagle right there at the end. So they are trying to recapture the glory of the Holy Roman Empire and the glory of Rome. And this is kind of what the Nazis mostly were going after in what they were doing. But you didn't come to hear about Nazi history necessarily. You came to hear about church history or Christian history. This is a group of Nazi young men outside of a German church they are encouraging those people to vote for the Nazi Party. The evangelical German Christian movement largely supported the Nazi rise. So here's a statement. It is a painful and complex historical fact that many of Germany's Christian institutions, leaders, and followers actively fueled the rise of Nazi Germany. One of Hitler's early statements was to be German was to be Lutheran. So he intimately linked state and church. Another statement, key factions of German churches did not just fail to stop Hitler. They actively fueled his rise by providing ideological justification, critical political legitimacy, and a passive base of support rooted in shared fears and hatreds. It is the story of Christianity that Christianity fueled the rise of Nazi Germany. A lot of times we don't talk about it, but Nazi Germany probably would not have been a thing if Christianity had not supported it. Maybe it would have, but...
Why were they supporting it? What belief did they latch on to?
A wide variety, mostly fears and hatreds. So it was a fear of Jewish people and their taking of their jobs, mostly driven by economical factors, as we just talked about, the hyperinflation. It was a fear of, in general, the idea that Germany was now less than, might be the way. So, hence why I gave us this slogan up there, make Germany great. Hitler did not specifically use that campaign slogan, but it was a driving force in much of what he wrote, spoke about, and when he is tying to be German is to be Lutheran together, and the greatness of the Lutheran Church also depends on the greatness of Germany, they sync up and they have this chance to fuel one another. And so many German Christians supported the Nazis. Go ahead.
So I think there's a difference between German Christians having fears and so therefore supporting this movement versus Christianity, somebody saying, oh, because the Bible says this and this and this, proves that these guys are right.
So
those two are different things, and so to say Christianity fueled it versus fearful Christians fueled it are two different things.
Okay, so I'll read this statement again. Key factions of German churches did not just fail to stop Hitler, they actively fueled his rise by providing ideological justification. The Bible says so. That is ideological justification in this case. We will see. You can read a huge number of pastors that supported Nazi Germany because the Bible said so. Now, you can shake your head and say no, but that does not change what they wrote back in the day. Critical political legitimacy. So, because the pastor thought the Nazi local person was legitimate, it added legitimacy to that person in the voting booth. And a passive base of support. So, maybe you don't agree with any of that, but you don't disagree with it, and that is the passive base of support. Go ahead, Dan.
There was a mixture of things that were going on. The fear of communism rising to the east, and that was, of course, a rejection of anything God-oriented, worship of the state, and not God. And so you had that as, well, we need to protect ourselves from that. Obviously, the ideological concept of the Jews killed Christ, so it's their fault, they should be blamed, fed into that. And also the moral decline that was part of the Weimar period, where sort of anything goes. And just as much as a lot of, there was Jewish background in the entertainment industry in America, so there was in that part of Nazi Germany that had an attitude that whatever you do morally is okay.
So all of that is in part true, but it does not change the fact that the Nazis do not rise to power without this overwhelming majority support of Christianity or German Lutherans. One of the key wins for Hitler was signing a treaty with the Pope that the Pope would not interfere. So, hold on. Let's read a German pastor's words as he reflected on this period. So, an initial Nazi supporter, Martin Niemöller. They came first for the communists, and I did not speak up because I was not a communist. They came for the Jews, and I did not speak up because I wasn't a Jew. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak up because I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for the Catholics, and I did not speak up because I was a Protestant. And then they came for me. And by that time, no one was left to speak up. Here is the larger context for this. So I'm reading Martin Niemöller's words here. The people who were put in camps then were communists. Who cared about them? We knew it. It was printed in the newspapers. Who raised their voice? Maybe the confessing church? We thought communists, those opponents of religion, those enemies of Christians, should I be my brother's keeper? What does Christ call us to do to our enemies? Love them. Then they get rid of the sick, the so-called incurables. I remember a conversation I had with a person who claimed to be a Christian. He said, perhaps it is right. These incurably sick people just cost the state money. They are just a burden to themselves and others. Isn't it best for all if they are taken out of society? Then we started talking until our voices were again silenced. Can we say we aren't guilty or responsible? The persecution of the Jews, the very way we treated occupied countries, or the things in Greece, Poland, Czechoslovakia, or the Netherlands that were written about in the newspapers, so it's not like people didn't know. I believe we have every right to claim guilt. We can talk ourselves out of it with the excuse that it would have cost my head had I spoken out. We pastors and all the communities in Germany had we pastors and all the communities in Germany defended truth until death, if we had said it back then, it was not right when Hermann Göring puts 100,000 communists in concentration camps in order to let them die. I can imagine 30 to 40,000 Protestant Christians would have had their heads cut off. But I also imagine we would have rescued 30 to 40 million people because that is the current cost. So, it may not have been always active for the majority of Christians, but it was very passive, silent agreement with what was going on. This is a concentration camp in Buchenwald, Poland. 90% of Polish Jews perished during the Nazi occupation. Now, if you've been paying attention along this class, this actually shouldn't be that surprising, unfortunately. Here's the United States and the Trail of Tears. 76% of Choctaws died during the Second Great Awakening. 97% of Creek. 93.5% of Chickasaw. 92% of Cherokee. 94% of Seminoles. Christianity, Southern Christianity, was a source of profound systemic betrayal and personal solace on the trails of tears. So you will find that sometimes they were passing through a town and a church might give them some water or some bread. But in general, when it came to the voting booth, the Southern Christians were happy to vote them out. Here's the Consistoire of John Calvin's Geneva, the jail of the Inquisition, the Crusades. I'll read an excerpt again. The Latin soldiery subjected the greatest city in Europe, Constantinople, a Christian city, to an indescribable sack. For 3 days, they murdered, raped, looted, and destroyed on a scale even the ancient barbarians would have been ashamed of. The Crusaders vented their hatred for the Greeks most spectacularly, halting to refresh themselves with wine, violations of nuns, and murder of Orthodox clerics. They smashed the silver iconostasis, the icons, and the holy books in the Hagia Sophia. The Greeks were convinced that even the Turks, had they taken the city, would not have been as cruel as the Latin or Western Christians. They were proved correct when Constantinople fell later to the Ottoman Turks. And this comes from our man Augustine in the middle there against the Donatists who convinced the Pope to persecute Christians. He persecuted Christians so badly that he expressed regret over how well of a job he did convincing the emperor to persecute the Christians. Did I say Pope earlier? Augustine convinced the emperor to persecute Christians. So, if you're looking through the pages of Western history, Western Christianity, you will see bright moments, the founding of hospitals and universities. But you're also going to see a lot of death. And so if we aren't careful, we're going to continue to see it again and again and again, because we keep looking to Augustine, 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 Augustine. There's Augustine looking across the way at Hitler. Now, look at the background in both. In all of the other backgrounds, there's some sort of Christian symbology to the right of the picture behind those men that were looking to Augustine. The innovation of the Nazis was to use Christianity as a bridge to get back to ancient Rome. They didn't care about Christianity. While it was widely supported by Christians, the true Nazis, Goebbels, the true upper echelon, they didn't care for Christianity. They saw it as a bridge to get back to the glory of Rome, and they were happy to use the Christians to get there. So, is Nazism a Christian movement? No. Was it widely supported by Christians? Yes. That is the nuance of Nazi Germany. But we did not come here to learn solely about Nazi Germany, but it did profoundly shape what is going to come next in our history. So, back to the United States of America. As I was saying beforehand, at the time of America's founding in the 1790s, roughly 5 to 10% of Americans were Christian. So that is a very small percentage. The highest percentage of Christians that will be American will be in roughly 1720 to 30, and it was around 80 to 90%. It will not cross, more or less, there are disagreements about this, 50% until the 1950s, which is where we're about to end up. And that was by design. This is James Madison, who wrote major sections of the Constitution. During the almost 15 centuries has the legal establishment of Christianity been on trial. What have been its fruits? More or less in all places, pride and indolence in the clergy, ignorance and servility in the laity, in both superstition, bigotry, persecution. Inquire of the teachers of Christianity for the ages in which it appeared in its greatest luster. Those of every sect point to the ages prior to the incorporation with civil policy. So when did Christianity become first incorporated with civil policy? That'd be 313, was the Edict of Milan, when Constantine made it a thing. And most firmly when Augustine wrote City of God in just after 400 during the collapse of Rome. The two became almost inseparably interwoven. And so it was our founders' idea and main thrust to push back, to separate church and state, to give us an opportunity to choose differently than the incorporation of church and state, which often leads to so much death that we have seen, particularly in Western Christianity. Now, if you go to Eastern and others, the story is a little bit mixed. You got highs and lows, but they also don't get state power a whole lot if you look outside Western Christianity. And so our founders chose a different path for us. Now, zooming back to the 1950s, when the war is over, the question we need to ask is, where did all those German theologians and philosophers land? And by and large, they landed in the United States and got prestigious professorial appointments at Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Brown. Wheaton College became a place where they ended up. Eventually, they'll go to Stanford and Oregon and a whole bunch of places, but they get all their way across the country and they start shaping the minds of the pastors of the United States. Now, what's going on in the wider world at the moment is, this is a picture of the Iron Curtain, is the idea of capitalism versus communism. And the US was very much ideologically capitalist and was feared that they might become communist. This was okay for all of these German theologians because by and large they were also anti-communist. So it was easy for the states to let them in to be trained pastors. But one of the key ways they fought communism was the endorsement of Christianity. This is Dwight Eisenhower, president just in the 1950s. And this is how he interprets the going forward policy of the United States government and faith in general. Truman started this. We'll see Truman here in just a second. And this is how they, the founding fathers, explained those. We hold that all men are endowed by their Creator. It's not by accident of their birth, not by the color of their skins or by anything else, but all men are endowed by their Creator. In other words, our form of government has no sense unless it is founded in a deeply felt religious faith. So pause right there. Deeply felt religious faith. He's saying this because in general, the view is that communists are atheists. And so his goal is to say, you can't be communist if you have a deeply religious faith. This is followed up by his next statement. And I don't care what it is. Whatever that religious faith is, he doesn't care. Of course, for him, it is the Judeo-Christian concept, but it must be a religion based with all men being created equal. So the US government more or less has three options if they want to root all of America in faith. You can either become Jewish, Muslim, or Christian. Jewish doesn't work because the Jews just don't accept everyone quickly and readily, and they don't have the infrastructure to accept a huge influx of humans. Islam doesn't work because by design, Islam has national interests. It was first called the Nation of Islam before becoming the caliphates. So they don't want religion taking over the United States because that's not what the United States was founded on. So that leaves them with Christianity. Christians had churches everywhere. The process of becoming a Christian was well known. Thank you, Jonathan Edwards, for studying that and writing that. That was a bit of last week. The nation had already been safeguarded from becoming Christian in the Constitution, separation of church and state. The Christians had the infrastructure to handle the influx of millions of euphoric post-war people. And best of all, Christians disagreed with each other, making it difficult to form a particular voting bloc. So until the late 1970s, early 1980s, churches were mostly 50% Republican and 50% Democrat. Sure, there were some that were 55-45, and I'm certain there are outliers there. But by and large, churches were political neutral zones. You could not count on all of the Church of Christ voting for the Republicans or the Democrats or whichever one you're hoping for. Churches were neutral. People were whatever they were based on other issues going on in their life. This will begin to change in the 70s, and we'll talk about that a lot next week. The U.S. government particularly used a young Billy Graham to spread the message of Christianity. Now, this does not mean that I think Billy Graham was a bad guy. I don't think he was purposefully trying to do bad things for the American government or anything like that. But he was one of the first pastors pictured in the Oval Office here with Truman. He was also broadcast overseas. His sermons were televised and broadcast overseas. That cost a lot of money and infrastructure at the time, far more than the young Billy Graham had at his disposal. It was financed and subsidized by the American government. Did he do great things? Yes. I'm not knocking Billy Graham, but a lot of his meteoric growth is due to a lot in his charisma, but also American government funding. In many ways, the American government wanted us to be Christian as a nation to fight communism. And we see that in the numbers. By 1955, 92% of Americans self-identified as Christians. By 1960, 2/3 of Americans are attending church weekly. Today, that's 25%. In 1954, we added the phrase "under God" to the pledge. So for the first time, we had God language in our major government, in our central government, federal government offices. In 1956, we added "In God We Trust" to the coinage, and it became the official model of the United States. So a lot of us think this happened in 1790. I know I certainly did until I did this research. But there you go. You can look it up on Wikipedia. You can look it up on a government website, and you will see the same information. It's all right there for you. Now, with Christianity becoming a major religion, the 92% is huge. Guess what there's a whole lot of? Money. There's a whole lot of money now flowing into Christian institutions. So Christians are going to invest heavily in research in universities. So the Christian American effort goes into Enlightenment evidence and anti-nationalism. So Enlightenment evidence is like archaeology, biblical language study. We have the Dead Sea Scrolls discovery and interpretation and find, and this is a major breakthrough. I'm not trying to diminish that in any ways, but that was a lot of money went towards archaeology and trying to create something that will be like evidence demands a verdict. Something that will be like evidence demands a verdict. So huge looking into the Holy Land and what kind of relics and artifacts can we find that prove the Christian narrative. And then they will begin looking at Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic in biblical languages. And now they're looking at Akkadian and Hieratic as older forms of those languages. Possibly original forms of Torah and the Old Testament in some cases. So there was a large shift in that kind of evidence demands a verdict. Let's figure and iron out all of the details. And there's a very enlightened, rational approach to it. And when I say enlightened, I want you to think the Enlightenment that happened in Europe between the 1700s and the 1900s, basically, like 1700 to 1900. So think that kind of enlightened rationalism. The other one will be anti-nationalism. So if we have all these German theologians and they know now, as we read earlier, like Martin Niemöller read, that Nazi Germany and the horrors of the Holocaust probably don't happen, or at least are not as severe if the Nazis don't have Christian support, they're going to work very hard to figure out, let's not do that again. You can see that in someone's work like Paul Tillich, who died in 1965 but lived through both world wars in Germany. His major work, The Courage to Be, I would highly recommend you pick that one up. It's only 200 pages, so it's not too bad. And he actually wrote it for the normal peoples. So it's not too hard. It's not too steeped with German words that only Germans and people who have PhDs know. It's a really good book. So I would recommend that. The other branch that will break out from this anti-nationalist movement is what we call today Liberation Theology. On your left is James Cone, and on your right is Oscar Romero of El Salvador, I believe. And the idea of liberation theology was to go for a theology of the oppressed. So one of Cone's most famous works is called The God of the Oppressed. And for Oscar Romero, you can read La Violencia del Amor, or The Violence of Love. So the violence of love, you may think that it's like, I'm going to love you and you're going to like it. But that's not what it's. Its central theme is not about physical violence, but rather the powerful, active, and self-sacrificial force of love, as the only true way to overcome systemic injustice, oppression, and hatred. Romero, who is ultimately martyred for his outspokenness, calls for a violence of brotherhood and a violence of love that actively defends the poor, challenges corrupt power structures, and seeks justice. This violence is the opposite of worldly violence. It is the courageous, nonviolent strength of the gospel to beat weapons into sickles for works, or beat your swords into plowshares, which you've probably heard, and build a society based on God's love and dignity for all. He also wrote, the option for the poor is simply the idea that, as reflected in canon law, the Christian faithful are also obliged to promote social justice and be mindful of the precept of the Lord to assist the poor. It indicates an obligation on the parts of those who would call themselves Christian, first and foremost to care for the poor and vulnerable. So you have a lot of your high-level thinkers leaning in to this kind of anti-nationalist sentiment, which came and fueled the rise of Nazi Germany by caring for the poor. Here is their main passage for how they get there. This is Matthew 25. I'm just going to read a small snippet here. So, starting in verse 34. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." The righteous will answer him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger," some translations now say foreigner, "and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you?" The king will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." So Jesus is identifying himself with the oppressed, as Cone will argue in The God of the Oppressed. So if you'll also notice in that, the Nazis fiercely protected food and drink from the Jewish people. They called the communists strangers. They stole clothes from people they were sending to concentration camps. So these are all opposites here of what was done in a nationalist sentiment or a nationalist version of Christianity. This is why, and so looking at Nazi Germany, these theologians are coming up with these new ideas saying, we have better tools, thanks in large part also to the evidence side of what Christians are doing, Dead Sea Scrolls, New Biblical Language Studies, all the things. But we need to compare it with a philosophical side that says we can't oppress people if we're Christians. Because if we're oppressing people, then we're not siding with Jesus. Because Jesus is in and with the oppressed people. So, out of that comes the question, who is oppressed? And so you start to get these various theologies that you've probably heard of born in the 60s, such as Black theology, James Cone, feminist theology, Rosemary Radford Ruther, theology of the poor, Oscar Romero, Latin American theology. You can read someone like John Sobrino for that. Differently abled theology. There are several good books I can recommend on that. So, and gender theology, especially paired with linguistics. So as we study the scriptures better and more firmer, Paul uses a word, let me see, it is agathosune, and it is the female word for virtue. It occurs in exactly 0 other Greek writing other than the New Testament and Paul, because virtue was a male quality. The idea of goodness was something that only truly men could attain to in Roman and Greek society. It is also something that has lingered as an idea in Christian society. And yet, if you go through and you find some of the Greek translations and you go real deep into the passage, you go, wait a second, he just used the word, he should have used a different word there, ariete. That's Aristotle, that's Plato, that's what his people would have been expecting as a word there to describe goodness or virtue. And yet he makes up his own word that has no other meaning outside of context, agathosune. And so there's this idea that the Bible is somehow supporting a female version of whatever's going on. Feminist theology. Agree, disagree with it, just reporting what's going on. Now, in America, we see all of this come to a head in someone like Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who was anti-Vietnam and Korea and pushed for civil rights and was Black, was a reverend, so primarily trained as a preacher, pastor, Christian, and a doctor, so he had his doctorate as well. So someone very well trained, very well thought of, highly charismatic. This is from his I Have a Dream speech. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children. So he's using Christian arguments to say, who's the oppressed people? It's Black people, it's women, it's poor people, it's Latin American foreigners, it's people who have disabilities, the so-called incurables, as we read earlier. It's people who have different gender ideas, whether they're right or wrong, still oppressed. Immigrants, the foreigner, the stranger among you. All of these people kind of fall under this idea of oppression as studied by the Liberation Theologians. And if you want to be anti-Nazi, the Nazis were against all these people. They didn't like any of them. And so it made sense that if you're going to move in an anti-Nazi place, these are the places you're going to go. And this is how you're going to think about and reinterpret the Bible and maybe look at it from a different perspective than you've looked at it your whole life. For someone like Paul Tillich, he was trained in Germany by theologians that were very on board with Nazis. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who is famously anti-Nazi, trained, his direct dissertation mentor, argued and preached for the Nazi rise of the Nazis. He was deeply disappointed in his mentor. They never got to have a conversation about it after the war. And so we see the idea and the fruits of this fusion between America as a Christian nation, which our government started, and which has now come from a swing of anti-Nazi movement and sentiment. Now, do you see the tension that should arise from that? If America is trying to create an identity of its own, is trying to say we are anti-communist, if trying to say we are capitalist, what about all these other groups? Now you have to take care of all these groups. And so there's a direct tension in our society that we're still working through today, that was born out of this period. Of course, Dr. King's work will lead to the Civil Rights Movement, or be a part of the Civil Rights Movement, which will have the Civil Rights Acts of 1957, 1960, and 1964. They were, of course, opposed by Christian Senator Russell, who proclaimed, "We resist to the bitter end any measure or movement which would tend to bring about social equality and intermingling and amalgamation of races in our southern states." I mean, you could read that from German propaganda in the 1930s. It's the 1960s in America. That's a Christian Texan right there, reading off why we should not vote for civil rights. It kind of flies in the face of these words. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with a certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." So, in Christianity, we have this move towards what is liberation theology, what today we call the liberals. You can see many of those liberal ideas on this board of those who are oppressed. You may disagree with those. This is the history. As I said before, history is not settled. We're certainly not covering all of it. And much of this is original research. So it is highly suspect. Or you should be very suspicious. You should absolutely do your own research. Don't trust me if you don't want. I'm fine with that. Let this spur you on to make your own conclusions. Some of you have lived through this period and may remember what it was like. Eugene Peterson, author of The Message, was a pastor in Baltimore during the race riots that were happening during the 60s. And he said one of his greatest regrets was not standing with the black pastors, theologians, people during those race riots in Baltimore. So, that's a lot of bells, which means I guess we're done. So next week, we are going to be picking up with what is called the conservative either resurgence or takeover in the Southern Baptist Convention. So that's right in the 70s, and depends on which perspective you are. If you are liberal leaning, you're going to see it as the conservative takeover. If you are conservative leaning, you're going to see it as the conservative resurgence. I will tell the story as neutrally as possible and let you make your own decision on which one it was. But that will get us into the into the 2000s, essentially. That will take us through the 1970s, Ronald Reagan's presidency, and then we kind of hop over the Clinton presidency because not too many interesting things really happen as far as Christian theology then, and into the 2000s when the SBC will change how it looks. And one of the fun things is during the 70s, the Southern Baptist Convention ends up adopting a lot of things that we consider original Church of Christ ideas. So some of them are originally Restoration movement, and then they get mixed in with the Southern Baptist movement, and it creates a swirly soup that we'll see how it tastes next week. So if you have any questions, as always, please come up and ask. Go rescue the teachers if you have small children.